All right. Hi, everyone. Just starting the recording. So like I said, today is going to be about process mining and how we can enhance modeling tools such as Bluewoks. And at first, we're going to be going through a short amount of slides. And then afterwards, Jared is going to be taking us through a demo. If anyone who doesn't know, my name's Amber Morgan. I'm a technical specialist in business automation at IBM. So that's anything from content to process management. And today, my partner in crime is Jared, who he is the VP of Client Services at Salient, Woo, and he is one of our business partners that specializes in all these process management tools. Okay. Jared, let's hit to the next one unless you have anything else to add. All right, so let's start off with where IBM's going. And what right now you're seeing is IBM is starting to build up a platform of all these core automations. So within this core automations, you have document processing, which includes capture, OCRing documents. You have workflow, which is creating workflows to have a single source of truth and organizing tasks and people. Decisions, that comes from people within an organization that have, let's say, tribal knowledge, and you want to put it to one simple source of truth, where you can have, let's say, approved documents or make decisions automatically or even update decisions on policies. Content management, where you can store documents in a secure fashion, define document security at like folder or even role or document level, making sure you have that control and that governance. And lastly, I'm going to pause for dramatic effect. You have your automation accelerators. Jared, could you click a couple of times to get all of them? Thank you. Your automation accelerators are your process mining, which we'll be talking about more later today. RPA, which is your robotic process automation. So basically completing those small tasks, minimizing on that manual mundane work. And operational intelligence, where that's creating dashboards where you can see what's going on, and then from there, apply automations. So the goal of IBM is creating basically a toolbox for you to pull which tools you need out and best serve your business. For example, RPA, robotic processing automation, does not serve as the end-all be-all for all automations. You need different specialty tools. Jared, I believe you say, you know, if you have a screw, you don't want to take a hammer to it, you want to have a screwdriver. So that is the overall goal of IBM's business automation platform. Jared, is there anything that you would like to add?
No, other than, and you said it very well, Amber, but the idea is that you do have purpose-built, best-of-breed technologies that you can apply to any business automation problem. We see a number of vendors out there that have a very core offering, like in an RPA space, that try to stretch and do other things, and it just does not work as well as using the right tool for the job. So I think the analogy of the toolbox and, you know, having a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but if you have the full toolbox, then you're going to use the right tool for the job.
Said beautifully. All right, let's go to our next slide. All right, process mining, the reason why we're here today. So currently, as you see on the slide, we deal with a lot of data. There's a lot of tools that produce data, and then we have to somehow manage it, and then from that, get insights to help better ourselves within our jobs. And that's where process mining helps come in, and it gives you a look at your external systems, reading your logs, your BPM, your, let's say, ticketing RCM tools, and helps you identify either applications or steps that you need to focus on or streamline. making sure that you find a bottleneck, or maybe somebody is taking longer at their task than usual, you want to know why, or there might be something that's happening in reality that you weren't even aware of, and you want to be able to either stop that process or at least minimize how much work goes through that process. So within process mining, it's basically a visual representation of what's going on end to end. And you can zoom in or out as much as you would like. And then you can analyze those steps, figure out what's going wrong, and then either simulate or figure out cost-wise if this new change that you want to implement is going to be the best path moving forward. Process mining is a very lightweight solution that we have here at IBM. Now, process mining is not the same as task mining. There is a key difference there. Task mining is a lot more on steps, analyzing those step by steps, making sure those are good candidates for robotic processing automation. Where process mining is kind of looking at your footprint of your process, the overall, the logs, the data that's going on. Jared, is there anything that you want to add to that?
I'm sure I will, but maybe we do that as part of the demonstration in our next step.
All right. That sounds good. Then I'll have you click to the next one.
I think the next one is our wrap-up, right?
Oh, then yep. Then you're on for your demo.
Right. So the picture is worth 1,000 words. I think a demo is worth 1,000 pictures. So let's jump in, and even though our focus today is going to be on process mining, we want to set the stage because a lot of our IBM customers and partners and IBMers, they're very familiar with process mapping. And even if you don't use Bluewoks Live, this is still going to be a valuable entry point into this idea of how do we tease out information about the process and how do we understand what's happening. I often like to use this analogy that I heard a few weeks ago about if we think of organizations as animals, many of them are not really operating in a full self-conscious way. They're more instinct-driven, looking for food, looking for water, looking for shelter, not really thinking about the bigger picture. And the only way that we think that you can get that bigger picture and that self-conscious view and understand how things operate is through process mapping, process documentation, process understanding. In our view, the best tool to do that is with IBM Bluewoks Live, although you can certainly use things like Visio, Lucidchart, and maybe other process documentation tools. But regardless of how you're doing that, this is going to give you a lot of interesting information about how the process or the business operates. One example that we'll use is in order fulfillment, right? This is a good example, not too complex, but also not too simplistic, that it's overly simplistic. So if we think about when you place an order with a retail store, there are a few things that you need to do to determine, is there inventory? Is this a delivery? Is this a pickup? And so being able to capture that flow and understand the various steps and start to document some of the things that go into that, such as who's responsible, what systems are involved, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, how long does it take? That gives us a lot of really good information about not only what happens today, but how can we improve this in the future. However, this is only going to give us the information that we know as stakeholders, as subject matter experts, as participants in this process. And so being able to capture that through interviews or even time studies or other kinds of methods it's still going to be the way that we think the business operates. This is one side of the coin, right? This is how we can get a very good picture, but it's not a complete picture. So using Bluewoks Live here, let's imagine that I've created a couple of different scenarios where I have a current state, and in this case, it is going to show us how long each of these steps take. So for example, when I review the new customer order, this is taking me on average 15 minutes. I think with automation or with some kind of improvement, I can get that down to 1 minute because that's happening over and over again. It's the same information, same inputs. I can create rules around that and maybe some RPA or some workflow. So if I look at the 2B model, I think I can now get that down to 1 minute. And that's very useful, right? So I can start to do some side-by-side calculations and understand, especially if I start to insert volumes into that, what I think the savings could be. But I still don't have a picture of the entire process, and I still don't have a picture of what the true side-by-side comparisons would be, especially taking into account things like rework and branching and parallel paths. So in order to do that, we can use a tool that's from Salient called Automation Compass. The purpose of this is going to be to generate data that we can then use in process mining. Right? One of the difficulties that we have with our customers is just getting access to the information, right? Getting access to the data. So how can we generate some data to use as part of our demonstration? And that's what we're going to do here. So using that information that we just created, I can import that process, run a quick simulation, generate the data, and then we'll show what that looks like in process mining. Following that, I will show you a real-world example that is much more complex and a lot more noise, but I wanted to start with the simple process first. So let's look at the special order fulfillment process and run this through a demonstration. And to do that, we can go and run simulation here, and this is going to carry over those snapshots and the times and some of the other metadata that we created in Bluewoks. So if I look at the as is, I see down here, indeed it is showing 15 minutes, and then I can get it down to 1 minute. Now, a few other things that we need to add to make this interesting from a simulation standpoint is the cost per resource potentially, the hourly cost, the cost per step potentially if I wanted to add a cost on each step. And so once I do that, I can add an additional piece, which is the gateway probabilities, right? If I'm branching or if I'm doing rework here, how often does that go back and cycle through? And that's a really important factor when I'm trying to figure out cost, right? So to do that, I'm going to say, well, in this example, in our as is, let's just say it's a really horrible process, right? That we are rejecting half of our orders. That's a pretty bad process, but let's just use that as our assumption here. In our 2B, I think with automation, not only will it improve this step and the cycle time, but it's also going to improve the quality of the data. And let's not go crazy, but let's just say that I can go from 50-50, maybe to 80-20. Now, the last piece that we need to add to this is the volumes, right? How often do we do this? If it's once a day versus once a year versus 100 times a minute, those are going to have dramatically different outcomes in terms of our cost savings and our times and our throughput. So what we can do here is let's just imagine this is a big ticket item example. We're doing 100 orders per week, so we're not going super crazy, and we say that the orders are coming in randomly. So I could specify some kind of distribution here, but in this case, we'll just assume random, and we're going to run the simulation, and it's going to provide side-by-side data. Now again, for those of you that have not seen Automation Compass before, there is a number of videos out there, and we're happy to share additional details on what else Automation Compass can do. But for the purposes of this webinar, what we've done now is generated actual process data that we can then use in process mining. Admittedly, it's going to be sanitized and somewhat simplistic because it is going through a simulation, but it will give you a good idea of what kind of data we can use to generate process mining models. So I'm going to go ahead and export this data out to my process mining. I'm going to show you what this process mining data looks like. And at the core, really the only things you need to use data in a process mining environment is an activity name, a timestamp, and some kind of unique ID. There's additional information that we can add, such as the end time, not just the timestamp, but the end time. That's going to help us understand gaps between each of the steps. We can add additional things like user IDs and resources, locations, geographies, store IDs, customer IDs, right? So there's a number of other things that we can do. One other interesting thing about that unique ID is that we can use the same set of data and look at it from different dimensions, through different lenses, using a different ID, right? If we're thinking about claims processing, I can look at that by customer ID, I can look at that by claim ID. I could look at that by agent ID. So there's a number of ways that we can look at that same set of data. This data also is going to come in different forms, right? Typically, starting point is log files. That's a very accessible place that we can start using that data, but it could also come from some kind of a data warehouse or data lake. It could come from real-time information. It could come from an ESB. And so we can feed that data in either in batch or in real time, but at the end result is going to be the same, is that we're creating these models of what the process looks like. And a big driver of this, and the big reason why this is important, is because while we showed how you can capture the way that we think the business operates, and that provides a lot of really useful information, we can miss things. We can miss the rabbit holes that people go down, or why does that person open that screen when they're processing that claim? We didn't capture that in our documentation. So we can start to get a picture of what the process is actually doing, but that's going to miss things as well, because it's going to miss the phone calls and the emails. And so only by marrying these two views together, and I'll show you what this looks like now, we can build a complete picture of our process, right, of how our business operates. And so what we're going to do is just create a new project in our process mining environment. We'll call this my order demo. We're going to upload that data that we just generated, and then we're just going to map the fields to the corresponding required columns, right? So here's my as is. We're going to upload it, and then it shows up here, and then we just map the fields. That's my unique ID. That's my step name. That's my timestamp. So those are the required fields, but we've added a few more just for this demo, where we have an end time. We have a resource, which can be a user ID or some kind of a username, and then the role, the department, the group. And once I do that, it will generate the process for me automatically. And now I can start to really dig into the process and start seeing some of the patterns and some of the flows and other things that are going to show up here. So a few things to note is we do have the ability to kind of change the lens that we're looking at this. So I can look at the minimum, the maximum, the average. I can look at the rework heat map, so it shows very clearly that first rejection, right? That 50% rejection of the orders is highlighted right here. I don't even have to really dig into it. We can look at things like cost and weighted durations and other information here. One other thing that this does, which is extremely interesting to our Bluewoks Live customers, is that IBM Process Mining will generate a BPMN diagram for you automatically. This is a very unique feature for IBM for process mining. This diagram, I would argue, is actually a more valid or more standard BPMN, because in my diagram that I imported, I actually have a loopback going directly into an activity, which if you're a purist in BPMN, that's a no-no. We actually need to have a split match with a join as a best practice. And so this will actually generate a very valid BPMN that I can then either import back into Bluewoks if I want to use that as a starting point, or I can even overlay this with my Bluewoks Live BPMN to see where are the differences, where are the gaps, where am I missing something. In some cases, you're going to miss the human activities in this view, right? You may have steps in Bluewoks Live that you don't have here, but it's also very likely that you're going to have steps here that you did not have in Bluewoks Live. So again, two sides of the same coin, looking at this from these different perspectives. Another really powerful thing that IBM Process Mining can give us is what we call rules discovery. This allows us to interrogate the process to start to understand, why do we go down this path or this path, right? What are some of the patterns? What are some of the views that we see? We see that this, in this case, when the order amount is greater than $500,000, we always go down this other path, right? So we can start to understand more about the process, more about the real world implications of what's happening. And so that helps us understand where we can improve, where we can automate. This is also not necessarily only static view or for discovery. This can also be a real-time view where I can go in and start seeing the actual live dashboards of this process. And so this helps to not only understand about how the process operates today, but as I start to apply improvements or automations, I can start to see the real impacts that those are having, which can feed back into my prioritization of those potential projects and understand where I need to change my assumptions, what other considerations I might need to take into account. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is come back into our process view and show what a real example might look like. So this is our sanitized version based only on the simulated data, right, that we generated using Automation Compass from Salient. But what I want to do now is import an actual claims processing example that is going to show a much more complex, much more involved process with a lot more noise. And this is going to look something like this. And I'm going to change some of the information here. So we're going to go back to 100%. So this is everything that is happening with my process, right? So if I zoom out, I can see it's a very noisy, in some cases, I have some activities that are only happening once. So again, that noise I can start to look at and say, well, do I really need to see that? And I can either purposely go in and click on it and say, ignore this activity, or I can use these filters on the left to say, I'm going to reduce this down to show me the 50% average, right, of things that are happening more than 50% of the time. And so you can change the view and really start to simplify more of the happy path, right, more of the common paths that this is taking, so you can really reduce that noise. Because the reality, if you were to kind of tie this into your own ERP or CRM or order system, it's going to have a lot of these outliers that you may or may not need as part of your analysis. And so we can start to dig into that. We can also look at this from different statistics as well. So I mentioned before, we can add custom fields to this as well, not just the timestamp and the activity name, but we could also add things like, in this case, city, right? Which cities are the most common in this path, or which conditions, or which, how much are we refunding, right? So these different patterns allow us to see these different variations and start to look at this through those different dimensions and really start to understand the process. Going into the BPMN, we also have a much more complex BPMN diagram, which can be reduced by that filter as well. So this is the more simplified version. If I come back over and I remove that that filter and I look at 100% of the activities and I pop back to my BPMN, it's going to show me a much more complex process. So we're going to go back and forth and just kind of refine this and understand really what is going on with this process. But hopefully you're seeing that based on this information and based on real data that we're pulling from systems, from log files, from instrumentation, we can start comparing this with our digital twin that we created using a process mapping tool like Bluewoks Live to really see the full picture of what's happening with a given process and really start to understand more about our business and to become much more self-aware as an organization so that we can be very thoughtful and deliberate about where we're applying improvements and where we're applying automations. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amber, and she's going to take you through a quick kind of differentiator for IBM, and then we'll wrap up and open it up for questions.
Definitely, and we have a few minutes, and thank you, Jared, for that awesome demonstration. But I wanted to highlight a few things that you talked about. And number one is I am a visual learner. When people present slides, I listen actually, or I'll see pictures on the slide. I gravitate to those more versus just reading a bunch of words, right? And with this tool, with this process mining, you could easily go in and see right then and there, oh, this one's dark blue. That's a lot of frequency going in there. Oh, this has a thicker line here. Okay, that's where most of our processes are going in and going through that. So that's why I really like this process mining tool. And Jared, you also touched on a few very unique things, which is generating that unique BPMN solution for more accurate viewings, and then comparing that to both your regular modeling model that you had versus the one that process mining creates. That's awesome. And in addition, it's creating that digital twin as well. It's using that real data, which is obviously what you need, but also using that log data and comparing those two, like you said, and what the webinar is about, two sides of the same coin. But for why it's different, that's really kind of what Jared talked about was, number one, you could show the rules discovery, understand why, and kind of go deeply into to understand what's going on and how we can use those rules. Number two, that digital twin, 3, that's simulation. And really, it's an easy tool to use, and it's very lightweight, and it's a very low cost, high ROI tool for you to use within your business. Jared, did I touch on anything on anything else, or forget to touch on anything else?
I think that was great. The one thing I would add is we didn't really dig into the task mining. I know Amber mentioned that earlier in the slides. That is another piece to this solution that is very compelling. It's more based on individual desktop activity and recording a user's clickstream and kind of the applications they're opening, much more related to something like RPA, right? And in fact, the IBM solution can automatically generate RPA directly from that task mining recording. But using that data to look at more at the individual level, if you're a process mapping person, I would say the process mining piece is more focused on the value stream or the L4 activities, and then the task mining is more the L5, kind of the more granular step-by-step approach and understanding how that business is running.
Correct, and that's where you get your toolbox, right? You have one tool that helps you find those tasks and then another tool that helps you act on that.
Got it.
So this is our end of our presentation. We have a few things of where you want to explore. Read up on our process mining. We are a process leader in this space and moving quite heavily up the ladder. You can try things, try the process mining for 30 days with no cost. And in addition, for acting on more, you can talk to Jared and I've linked our IBM LinkedIn, and you have the QR code too to instantly put time on Jared's calendar. But let's kind of turn it over to questions. I see there was one in the chat to get a copy of those slides. Those will be sent out in the email that will be sent out afterwards. But is there any questions or anything? I would just say either try to raise your hand and I'll get to you to unmute you, or just type them in the chat.
Stunned silence.
Silent, yes. All right, but that concludes our very short webinar today. Thank you, Jared, for doing that awesome presentation. Like I said, I'll be sending these out and talk to us. Oh, I see one in the chat, but either talk to us on LinkedIn or et cetera. Oh, very good presentation. Well, thank you, appreciate it. But talk to us on LinkedIn and we'll be happy to help you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.